Welcome to the Calling the Quarters podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. This is Season 2, Episode 5. Today I'm speaking with author Ben Stimpson, who is a therapist, lecturer, student, and spiritual director. Ben has developed courses on a variety of topics, including Ancestral Veneration, the power of story, and folklore. In addition to his new book, Ancestral Whispers, a guide to building ancestral veneration practices, Ben has a podcast called Essence Podcast with Ben Stimpson, where they talk with pagan authors about paganism. I found this conversation to be very insightful, and I learned a lot about the topic of ancestor veneration, something I believe will be coming up a lot in the coming years. I'll be taking you now to my conversation with Ben Stimpson. Welcome to the Calling of the Quarters podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. Today I'm very, very happy to be talking to Ben Stimpson, a therapist, lecturer, student, and spiritual director who has developed courses on a variety of topics, including ancestor veneration, the power of story, and folklore. When not working with clients and writing, Ben is engaged in his class of study, religious studies, medieval and classical studies, folklore, and spirituality. Ben, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk with you today.
I want to talk a little bit about your story of where you grew up initially and then where you continued to grow up and how that kind of affected who you came to be.
Absolutely. So I'm originally from the United Kingdom. I grew up in North Wales. My parents are English, but I was born in Wales. And for 8.5 years of my life, I lived over there. We emigrated to Canada when I was 8.5, and I landed in a tiny little town, middle of nowhere, 8,000 people and 18 churches. And so I suddenly went from being kind of just normal, right? Just me in amongst all the people I grew up with. Suddenly I was different. I was foreign. I was an immigrant. I was British. I was all of these things. I was different. And then that difference just kept coming on. So I came out as gay when I was about 14. Around that time, I also found paganism, partly because I was really dealing with a deep culture shock, and I was trying to find my way home again, even if it was just emotionally. So I latched onto anything that reminded me of Britain and the UK. I would watch all the British comedies, British television shows, documentaries. Attenborough was a big part of my life back then. And how I came to paganism originally was through folklore. So I really loved we had several books when I was really young about Welsh folklore and British legend and whatnot. And I always, like, culturally speaking, we grew up with King Arthur and Robin Hood and all of these classic kind of parts of British culture. So I came across the Myths of Avalon when I was about 15. And really loved this image of this loving mother goddess that was connected with Britishness, and at least for me. And so then I started to call myself a pagan, started to research it. I got onto the Witchvox, which was, for those older people listening to this, they'll know what Witchvox is.
Oh yeah.
Right. And got onto some of the places like Pagan Space, Mystic Wix. And then for me, paganism was just a part of my life growing, like, as a teenager and early 20-something. But it was online. I didn't have community. And so I went to university, continued my studies, and in my mid-20s I actually started to attend the festivals in Ontario here. I grew up in Ontario, Canada, and suddenly I found community. I found not only people who were like me, but people who celebrated the fact that I was British, the fact that I was gay, the fact that I was pagan, all of these things. And then from there, I just started to really connect in with that sense of spiritual community and develop. So then from there, Hinduism had been a big thing for me when I was younger. Again, it was that, like, living community. I went to a school in Toronto, so I was surrounded by a very large Indian population, went to temple there. And there was nothing. I really loved that aspect of my spirituality, but it wasn't home. Right. When I was in my later 20s, I came to Lukumi Santeria, the Afro-Cuban tradition, and lived with my godfather for a couple of years while I was in school again for psychotherapy. But again, it didn't feel like home because it wasn't my cultural background. It didn't speak to me in the same way as the figures from my British background did. But don't get me wrong, I love the Orishas, and they were very, 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 very kind to me. And my life changed completely. But throughout this whole process, it really has been a sense of being called home. And home is the landscape and all of the spirits and beings that live on that landscape of my origins. So I hope that answers the question. I hope I didn't go too far off the rails there.
No, not at all. I love this answer. So did you start like investigating any British gods, deities? Like, did you have connection with anything in England? What happened with that for you?
Well, so originally when I came to paganism, a lot of it was kind of a mishmash. So I didn't really know anything about the ancient Celtic tradition
Right.
because that really is a hidden part of the culture, right? So a lot of my connection with Britishness was through this kind of 80s, 90s neo-pagan vision of what the ancient Celtic past looked like. And it was heavily connected with King Arthur and that Arthurian cycle. And then when I started to kind of go off and explore, I was looking at Hinduism, Shiva. I was looking at the ancient Greek pantheon, particularly Dionysus and Hermes. I was checking in with the Orishas. I was connecting with the landscape here, which I didn't really have, excuse me, a connection with. And so I was lost for a long time. And that's, I think, where the ancestral piece comes in. Why ancestor work really helped to guide me back towards the British Isles and all the spirits and gods that have existed over there and had connection with it. And so in 2018, around the same time, I was working on my ancestral work through Lakumi. Around the same time, I was involved in psychotherapy training. I also joined the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids. And that was my way of really wanting to connect back in with the I hate the word Celtic, but it's the best word I can use to
Yeah.
encapsulate, right?
Yeah.
Because I was born in Wales, but my background isn't Welsh.
Yeah.
I have Welsh ancestry. I have Scottish ancestry. Actually, on like, if I go back 3 generations to my great grandparents, all of them are from all corners of the British and Irish Isles. So I had connections with all, like Ireland, Scotland, down south in England, Wales, and with Cornwall. And it's been interesting negotiating that for myself because I don't really have a strong sense of a connection to Ireland. The Tuatha Dé don't speak to me in the same way that some of like the Romano British speak to me. Some of the local spirits in North Wales speak to me, right? But being over here and being far away from that landscape, it's been a journey. Part of my journey home, physical journey home, is also to be reacquainted with those spirits. So the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids helped me with that. Luckily, I was in a good position where I was able to actually interact and connect with some of the major. Actually, Christopher Hughes, who you've had previously on,
Yeah.
was a friend of mine, and so I really connected in with him and learned a lot about Welshness from him. Through that connection, I also became good friends with Mara Starling, who put out the Welsh Witchcraft book. So really, I've heavily invested in learning about that part of my spirituality through the people who live on that landscape and are connected with that landscape in a different way than I currently am. So it's been a journey, but yes, I've heavily connecting in with that landscape and the spirits there.
I'm curious, did you get a chance to eventually travel back to England at any time and visit again?
I did. So one of the kind of the issues with my family is my parents are the type of people where once a chapter closes, it's gone and done.
Yeah.
So we never went on holiday when I was a kid. I grew up in a self-employed household. They ran their own business. And a lot of the kind of a trauma of growing up in that space was my parents had no interest in going back to the UK. So we never did. And so it took almost 15 years for me to get back there. Eventually, I was very lucky to be able to get a job at a satellite campus from Macquarie University in Sussex in England. And I worked over there in 2010 for a good 5 months. And through that, I was able to then go on weekend journeys and travels, field studies. So it was kind of like my return home tour. And so 5 months I lived over there and worked over there, and then I spent a month up north with my extended family. And then I came back to Canada, and I was overcome with a sense of homesickness, um, and a sense of grief because I had to leave. And so I always intended to go back home. And I think that's where the seeds of I'm going to do this one day eventually came, and now I'm actually doing it. So.
How did it affect you when you first landed on British soil after not being there for more than a decade? How did that affect you? Did Was that kind of a little bit of a shock to you, or was it a kind of gradual kind of reacclimating?
Well, I think because I had consumed so much of British culture over here, and because my family from over there often came over and visited us, I was
Yeah,
always surrounded by and involved in that community, but from afar, right?
yeah.
Um, I didn't really acclimate to Canadian culture very well. I had some friends when I was a teenager, but most of my time was spent by myself. And it was only in university and in my 20s when I really connected in. Most of the people who I connected in with had either relationships to that landscape or they're from there themselves. So I feel like a lot of my community was connected with that space. So when I went over there in 2010, it felt very strange because I suddenly felt like I felt the difference suddenly. Like I have a Canadian accent as well as a British accent. And because I was surrounded by Canadians, I was over there as a Canadian visiting, right? I felt at times that I had to fight for people to see me as being, as belonging over there. And when they did finally, like when I would say, "Oh no, I'm actually originally from here," then oh, come and speak to us. Oh, and tell us about your journey. Tell us about there was that connection. But before that, I was seen as a tourist. So I think that caused a lot of an issue for me, and now I'm completely in a liminal space. I always will be in a liminal space. And most immigrants, I think, most people who move to a new area will always find themselves in that space of being in between where they came from and where they are now. And I found power in that, but certainly I'm preparing for myself to have culture shock again. There's certain things that I'm seeing over there that are really really annoying me, such as like the indirectness that's part of the culture. So you know.
What was the
Mm.
biggest, I mean, from what I've seen of Canadian culture, I think a lot of people assume they're just like the United States, and I really don't believe that's true. From what I've seen of Canadian culture from the outside, I see a lot of almost kind of what I don't want to use this term because it's got a negative connotation, but I can only use it because it's the only word I can think of, but kind of a nationalism. People that are Canadian are very proud of being Canadian. They think and talk a lot about it. It's a big deal, especially regionally. There's different regions. Canada's a big country, and Canada's different in different parts. What was the biggest cultural shock for you when you moved there, and what do you perceive of it now after you've lived there a while and you're going to be going back to England? What are your thoughts of being somebody who lived there for a while?
Well, I think a lot of people, a lot of Americans, what they don't understand about Canada is how much of the national identity of Canada is formed through comparison to the United States.
Yeah,
Because I think a lot of Americans just assume that it is just like the United States. There's a lot of many big differences, but I also think that Canadians are more like Americans than they are British. But I think it depends on what region. I think we need to see Canada as Canada's. If you go down to the Maritimes, Newfoundland, which only joined Canada in the 1840s, you go down to Nova Scotia, you go down east, right? There's a real sense of identity and very strong roots to Ireland and Scotland, right? You go to Quebec, same thing, really strong roots of Quebecois and Francophonie. I think Ontario, because Ontario contains, I would say, the majority of the population. We have something like 10 million people living here out of like 35 million people. Ontario's culture is very, very similar to the United States. Most Ontarians go down to New York or Detroit or into to go shopping, to go visiting. You know, a lot of people here. It tends to be a big immigrant population because Toronto attracts a large number of immigrants. So just like many U.S. American cities, same thing. There seems to be that connection to the states. Of course, a lot of our media is also connected to the states. So I really do think that there's a lot more similarities between Canada and the United States than there is differences. But
Yeah.
that being said, Canada is also we have our monarchy that's the same as the British monarchy. Our way of like our democracy is different up here, and certainly when we're looking down at the states, we're looking down on the states, right?
Yeah.
So I for culture shock, I think for me the culture shock was because I was 8, right? Like I acclimatized very, very quickly to Canadian culture. What caused culture shock more for me was those little things like you know, how I saw myself, how I spoke about my emotions. British people, at least from 30 years ago, didn't really speak about their emotions, and it
Yeah.
wasn't encouraged. Right. I would say, if anything, UK culture now, especially younger people, because they grew up on American TV and because of the cross cultural connections, I would say that British culture has taken on a lot of that lack of indirectness when it comes to talking about feelings, talking about emotions. But it's a very generational thing. So yeah, it's going to be very interesting. I think that there's an insularity that the UK has, and we're certainly seeing that because of Brexit. That is very similar to the insularity of the United States, whereas Canada and Canadians, they're so used to traveling to another country all the time because you know a majority of the places in Canada are only 3 hours from the US border. So you know we're not traveling only within this one country. We're traveling to Cuba, we're traveling down to Mexico, we're traveling to the United States, we're traveling to Europe, right? And so I feel like Canadians are a lot more cosmopolitan than a lot of Americans. But
Yeah.
there's a reason for that. America has everything that you could possibly need in a country. It's got maritimes, it's got mountains, it's got huge national parks, it's got such a varied landscape, and it's such a huge country that somebody could live their entire life in the United States without needing to go outside of it. So
When you're a pagan in America, it can be easier or harder depending on where you live. Where I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, it is easier to be a pagan in some ways depending on what part of the Bay Area you live in. You can be
absolutely.
out as a pagan at work and you're not going to have to worry about your job safety in most cases. Again, depending on what part where you live. But if you live in the heartland or you live in Texas, it could be, even life or death if you're a pagan, maybe in some cases, especially with our love of guns and gun violence. Is it hard to be pagan in Canada?
No, I would say no. I mean, I think people would disagree with me on that. I think that it depends again what part of Canada you're in. If you're in Alberta and in the kind of the central provinces, that culture is much more like the heartland in the States than it
Yeah.
is kind of, you know, Ontario tends to be, because it's so diverse, we don't tend to have now anyways that many issues with people practicing. I would say probably 20 years ago it was the same as down in the States. You know, the
Yeah.
satanic panic happened up here the same way that it happened down there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a thing. I like Ontario is a very strange place because you have this massive population in Toronto and around the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area. You have something like 4 million, 5 million people in that one area alone. And then suddenly you go outside of it and it's like middle of rural nowhere, right? And that rural culture is very, very similar to rural culture in the Midwest, like Iowa, Illinois. Very similar lifestyle, a lot of connections because it's so close, right? So in smaller towns, if you had said you were anything different even 20 years ago, you would have had you would have had all sorts of problems. Now, because of the way Toronto has gone, so many people from Toronto in terms of expenses. So many people from Toronto have moved out into the smaller communities that you're seeing a varied diversification. So I feel like that's mellowed. I think it's also a generational thing too. Um, so it depends. It depends. Yeah, it really depends. But talking about witchfox from before, like Qaurters, who
Oh yeah,
was
yeah.
one, yeah, Kerr. So he was over in Vancouver, and I know he, like in the early 2000s and late 90s, he really did a lot of fighting for, pagan rights in that region. So again, I think it depends, really. Yeah.
I want to talk to you about your new book out. There's so many things that I want to ask about it. It's for many reasons, and we're going to go into this more. Can you talk about Ancestral Whispers? How did you come to write it? How did you come to conceptualize it and pitch it to Llewellyn? Let's talk about Ancestral Whispers.
Absolutely. So Ancestral Whispers started originally as a project that I did in my psychotherapy program. So when I was training from 2017 to 2019, one of the big projects that we had to do was a family history project. And it was a form of self-therapy. It was a form of understanding ourselves in relation to our family story and our family context. And we were using family systems theory as a model. So we did a huge project with that. And by the time I came to the end of that program, I was starting to think about what can I do to offer clients, because these days you can't just do therapy. You really need to be offering courses, doing other things. Same with any other profession, I think. So I started putting together an ancestral, because the program I was taking was spiritual psychotherapy. I started putting together an ancestral veneration course, which would include the psychotherapeutic piece, but also involve the spiritual. In 2019, when I looked around at what was ancestral work in the pagan community, a lot of it was, and I'm going to generalize here, but a lot of it was really paying lip service to the ancestors. I think I understand why. There's a lot of pieces as to why that was. I think part of it is religious trauma. A lot of pagans don't know how to work with their ancestors, especially all those millions of ancestors who were Christian in between here and where a lot of pagans want to go with ancestor work. And I think also because there are no real rituals. A lot of the ancestral traditions around the world, they have living ancestral practices that go back in time, many, 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 many generations. Neo-pagans don't have those. We're used to building our own and reconstructing from the ancient, right? So I didn't really see anything. So I thought, okay, well, I'll do this. I'll put this course together, put together an 8-month course. And then as soon as I finished writing it up, the pandemic happened. Suddenly I had no clients, and I had a lot of time on my hands. And so I moved later that year. I moved into my own place, and I sat down with a friend of mine who's also a Llewellyn author, and I said, I have this course I've put together, and she encouraged me to actually do it. So I ended up putting it out there, and the first set of sessions, I think I had 6 or 7 people as part of it, and we had a wonderful time. By the time that was late 2020, and I thought, what, I want to do something with this. So I sat down with her again, and I said, I think this would make a good book. I think I've tested it. We've gone through the process. I see the benefit of this. And so she gave me some advice on kind of what the process of approaching a publisher would be. And so I put together a framework and sat down with that, and I wrote the book. And then eventually, so what I did was I actually wrote the book first and then sent it to the publisher. What I should have done is I sent it to the publisher first and then wrote the book. But I spent 8 months putting that together. And what was really important with me when putting this together was I wanted the experiential piece. Having experienced a living ancestral veneration framework in Lukumi, and having that relationship with my ancestors in that way. They're not symbolic, they're not archetypes, they are existing in my life. it was important for me to write a book that was going to allow people to be inspired to take ownership of their practice without me giving them a ritual to do. Because I think that's one of my criticisms of a lot of pagan books around ancestor work is it gives you things to do. Problem with that is that oftentimes people who don't know what to do in the first place will take that wholesale, and then you're not relating to your ancestors, you're relating to the person whose ritual that is ancestors, even if it's using your own ancestors. It doesn't make any
Yeah.
sense. That's part of the reason that cultural appropriation is such an issue, is because you're not engaging in communicating with your ancestors. You're using somebody else's words to try to communicate with your ancestors, and that's not going to work. That might not work for various different reasons. So I wrote the book as more of a primer to lay out the worldview of ancestor veneration, lay out the various ways around the world that others and other communities interact with their ancestors in this way. And then the questions of now, how do you relate to yours? To take ownership of their worldview, of the reader's worldview, to explore the subconscious worldviews that we exist within all the time. And then I ask for good questions in this book.
I want to break this down a little bit further. Just from a personal side, I find this intriguing, especially right now, because I've had a lot of deaths in my family recently, and I feel like I'm having visitations from some ancestors, and it's really palpable for me. But normally in my practice, and I think with a lot of people, maybe many pagans out there who are listening now, usually we'll trot out our ancestors at Samhain, and we'll do like a little altar, a dumb supper, or something like that. And then for the rest of the year, we're like, piss off, we'll see you again at Samhain next year. And so, like, for me, this is very intriguing because I think it's something that's been kind of an elephant on the table in the pagan community for a while, but we're not really addressing, and now you are. So can you talk a little bit about it and your practice and how it kind of works?
So I'm going to preface this by saying this is my practice. I am
Right.
not, I am hoping that no one takes this and tries to apply it to their own life, because
Okay.
that really goes against the whole point of my book.
Yeah.
My relationship to my ancestors is developed partly because of my cultural shock and the trauma of being ripped away from home when I was younger, right?
Yeah.
Part of my journey back to my ancestors, and in some ways being guided by them back to this place, is so that I'm in a healthy place in order to interact with them and interact with the family story. But also, part of it is to acknowledge the scope of the ancestors. So I think we often think about ancestors as just being blood, those ancestors of blood. Now, that's a very Western point of view. It's a very
Yeah.
old and ancient Western view. But when you look around the world and other marginalized communities, even in the United States and Canada, the sense of what constitutes family is much broader. And so it isn't so much about the qualifying the type of relationship. It's about relationship, right?
Right.
So for me, a big part of my ancestor work is in connecting with those who have impacted my life in various parts of my identity, whether it be my ethnic identity as an English or Welsh person, right? Whether it be as my spiritual identity, as somebody who is a neo-pagan, folkloric witch, whatever, however way I describe myself, right? My intellectual identity, my sexual identity, right? My gender identity, all of these pieces. So whatever community I happen to be in that moment, I have ancestors of that community that I'm interacting with and I'm existing as because of my relationship to them, right? So my actual physical practice is all ways of communicating with those individuals and those groups. And so it takes on different forms depending on that. My main way of ritual practice, and I tend to see ritual practice as being a form of communication. So my main framework comes from Lukumi. I use the kind of the framework that I was taught in Lukumi, which is having an ancestral shrine all the time, not just at Samhain, not
Yeah.
just at one point in the year. I'm interacting with my ancestors by giving them food, placing offering down, speaking to them, praying to them, right? Part of the metaphysics of that altar space then ties into the worldview that I'm seeing and understanding the ancestors through. So I'll never place my ancestor shrine close to the living heart.
Right.
The living heart of the home, which is the kitchen, because there needs to be a separation between the idea of death and the idea of life. The kitchen is really about life. So I place the ancestor shrine near the back door, which exits, right? And speaking about worldview, then the idea that I'm not taking on a Judeo-Christian worldview of the ancestors as being in some far off remote place. I'm
Right.
understanding that they are accessible here all the time. And because they're accessible here all the time, I need to keep working at building that relationship in the same way that they're constantly building their relationship with me. So it's about understanding then their impact in my life now. It's understanding that I can communicate with them now in various ways. And that's why grief and mourning traditions are different from veneration traditions.
Right.
Mourning is about the passing. Mourning is about the getting the individual to where they need to be in a spiritual sense. Whereas veneration is once they're there, it's interacting with them, right? Does that make sense?
It does. I got to ask you, this must be, and if this is too personal, we can, edit it out. This must be really healing, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely it was. Absolutely was. It was one of those things that I didn't realize how much trauma I received from moving over here. And for the vast majority of my life, part of the big issue was I felt like I didn't have any control because of that. Now, part of that is also growing up in a family where my parents exhibit narcissistic traits. I love my parents, don't get me wrong, but they are both narcissistic in many ways, and that caused issues around control within the family. Um, Part of the healing from that has been understanding that I do have power in my life. And that, I think, has come from my ancestors. Right? That has come from them inching me towards where I need to be, healing from fucking up my life in multiple ways. Right. One of the reasons I went into social work originally was because I didn't know what to do with my life, because I didn't feel like I really had a life. Right. One of the reasons that I so heavily focused on the past was because I didn't really see a future for me, because I wasn't taking control of my own life. Right. I
Yeah.
think also that idea of working with death, and understanding legacy also brought in a great deal about responsibility. And many times in my life, I was very irresponsible, and that caused some very unhealthy things in my life. So I think that understanding that legacy piece in working with ancestors, and understanding that my context came from my ancestors, whichever ancestor group we're talking about, then made me understand, okay, I am a link in a chain. I can't be the end of that chain, right?
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about one of the things that I saw in one of the topics in one of the chapters that is reincarnation versus multiple lives? Can we discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. That's I think in chapter 2 or chapter 3, something like that. So part of that conversation is I often get asked this about, if we believe in reincarnation, then what exactly are we connecting with if we are thinking of ancestors, right? Because the whole idea of the ancestors is that they are in some sort of dead space somewhere, that they are in some sort of afterlife. So if you believe in reincarnation, then your soul doesn't go to an afterlife; it goes to a next life, right? And so I think that again speaks to that idea of, like, who a relationship, and like what is your worldview around this. You have people who say they believe in reincarnation, but they want to do ancestor work. Well, how is that going to work if if you think that there's nothing there, right? So I discuss the various ways that one can approach this for themselves. there's this idea of a multiplicity of the soul. So in many ancient cultures, many contemporary cultures, there's this idea that the soul of a spirit is actually made up of multiple other parts. Only some of those parts go to get stored in an afterlife, while other parts go on to incarnate again and again, right? So I think that question really, it comes down to where people are at with that. But again, that is part of the greater conversation about worldview. And if you're building a practice that doesn't make sense to your underlying worldview, then what's going on for you? Like, is it going to become very confusing really quickly? So, so that piece is big. I think that in many of the cultures that have reincarnation as part of them, there are certain kind of built-in pieces. So in Hinduism, for example, the Western view is that reincarnation happens immediately. Over there is this stream of thought that an individual has to wait for 3 lifetimes or 3 generations in order to then reincarnate. When you look at that, that really ties into that idea of within living memory. So once somebody passes just past the border of living memory, then then they're released to go on to their next life. There's other streams of thought, which is that the personality exists in an afterlife state, whereas the animating part of the soul goes on to live. And so at the end of time, the end of existence, all of the various incarnations come together to form together. But in the meantime, what you're actually interacting with as an ancestor is this personality in an afterlife, right?
Wow.
This is all supposition. It depends on how you're seeing it. I think it also depends on your own relationships with your ancestors. I think that the vast majority of neo-pagans will come from a Judeo-Christian background.
Yeah.
And so then that worldview is really heavily involved, even in neo-paganism. As much as people strive to kind of come out of that cultural view, if you really ask a lot of people kind of what they really believe, they'll be unsure about their neo-pagan beliefs, because the Judeo-Christian concepts of soul and body and afterlife is so imbued into the culture, right?
Absolutely. And I don't think people talk about this enough, because I do think we are very still influenced as pagans by our Judeo-Christian background. I find that like Catholic pagans and Baptist pagans and Lutheran pagans probably have very different practices. And I think probably because it's really hard to shake that stuff,
Well, so much of it's subconscious, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's why I spend so much time and effort in my book to point out and get people to think about the subconscious when it comes to what they're actually doing. Because again, it can become very confusing if you're saying one thing but doing another when it comes to ritual practice. It just doesn't make sense, right? But I think also there's this pressure within neo-paganism to take up a worldview that might not actually really be all that important to you. And I think that's one of my soapbox moments, is this idea of, seeing all of this as symbolic or psychologizing it to death, right?
Right.
I think that I for me at least, the importance of ancestor work is understanding that these are beings and not just symbolic archetypes that are floating around, right? Same with spirit work, right? It's far easier for a symbolic archetype not to fuck you up versus the spirit that you're dealing with, right?
Right.
I apologize. I hope I'm okay to swear on this, but
You're totally fine. Can we talk about the idea of the founder ancestor that you mentioned in the book?
Yeah, for sure. This one I actually realize is fraught, because depending on the cultural context, it's going to mean something different. So in old world countries and cultures, the history goes back thousands of years, sometimes uninterrupted, right? In settler countries, oftentimes you have settler founders who come over, and that's maybe only 300 years tops, right? So oftentimes it's either within living memory or it's well documented. So in older cultures, you tend to find that there's a lot more mythological founders of towns and settlements and places than there are named historical individuals. Partly that's because the individual has passed out a living memory, partly because the community has needed to create a legendary character in order to put all sorts of pieces around identity onto them, right?
Yeah.
So in Europe and in Asia and in Africa, most of those places are mythological. Oftentimes, some of them through apotheosis have become deities. Oftentimes, they've become semi-human. So you'll see like Gog and Magog, for example,
Yeah.
in right, the giants, all of these things. In Canada, the United States, and Australia and New Zealand, particularly. I'm not saying South America because that's a different context, but in
Yeah.
those settler cultures, you have founders who they came in, they found land, and they built a settlement there. Often, at times, at the expense of the local indigenous people.
Yeah.
Right? So you have these founder figures who are the founders of the town, the historical individuals, but they've started to become semi-legendary because the community has needed a sense of origin. That's really where mythology is coming from. It's that sense of origin. So, a founder of a particular town it didn't just come over and kill a load of indigenous people. He fought his way through the wilderness. He founded this settlement. He brought people here to create community, right? And then you have Founders Days. So it's that celebrating of that founder at the expense of the actual history because it serves the purpose of the community identity, right?
Yeah.
So the same process happens in Europe and the old world. It's just those founders are now mythological beings. So you have the pageant of Gog and Magog, or you have the pantomime about the founding of this town by this saint who happened to be running from the Romans, or whatever it is, right? There's this pageantry about it, right? So I think how people relate to this sense of founders is going to depend on their cultural context. I think also we then start to stray into this idea of apotheosis. When you think of quite a few ancient cultures, the founder becomes kind of the figurehead group. So you often see the idea of like the house gods in Roman and Slavic cultures, the brownie to some degree in English culture and Scottish culture. They become the figureheads, they become the central kind of focuses for the whole collective. And oftentimes then venerating the founder, venerating the house god, venerating the patriarch or the matriarch of the family, then you're venerating the whole family, and you're venerating your place within that family and your sense of that community, right? So I think that, again, it depends on kind of what cultural context you're coming from, but the sense of if you don't know who your ancestors were by name, you can still venerate or work with that particular individual who then becomes bigger than life and becomes a container of everything that community needs of them. If that makes sense.
It does. I mean, this is so provocative. I really think this is going to explode out once people really start reading the book. This is going to become a very talked about thing. Can we talk a little bit about some of the rituals that you have in the books, and if you don't mind?
Of course. Well, there are no rituals in the books.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
very intentional. I haven't given any ritual for people to follow in this. What I have done though is in the second half of the book, I've broken down all of the elements of a living ritual practice.
Uh-huh.
My approach with ritual is my understanding of ritual is that it is a form of communication that uses gesture, symbol, and performance as a way of communicating with spirits, the deities, each other, whatever, right? So I talk about how then what do all those elements mean? What can they mean? What use do they have? And so then I use a lot of examples of what ritual could look like. Ritual depends. Ritual is as useful to us as brushing our teeth in the morning.
Yeah.
Right? We can build a whole spiritual routine that will allow us to interact with the other and the spiritual world and ourselves too. Sometimes rituals are about about communication. Sometimes they are about gaining something, so propitiating, putting food down with the hope of as an offering, with the hope that your ancestors or the spiritual beings are going to come in and help you in your life, right? Magic is a ritual, right? And I think that's one of my major qualms with how often ancestral work is talked about in witchcraft and paganism as a form of magic. Well, it isn't a form of magic. Magic is a form of ritual and a form of practice, but not everything is magic. With ancestral magic, what you're essentially saying is, I'm going to work with these beings because I'm getting something out of it. I have a task and I have something I want to get. Whereas veneration is building that relationship. So all of the rituals that I talk about in the book are really about strengthening relationship so that then you can go and propitiate or work with these beings in magic, or even just to have them as part of your life, right?
Yeah. We talked before we started recording a little bit about your book and the many aspects of it. And I feel like for me, somebody who's read Llewellyn books for years and has, many of them in my collection, I feel like this book and a few others that are coming out now are kind of a sea change for Llewellyn. From the cover, usually the cover is not a big deal, but for me, I think it was a huge telling sign, because I was almost honestly, and I don't mean this to sound bad, but like when I saw the cover, I was like, I was not sure it was a Llewellyn book to start off with. I thought maybe there was a mistake and I'd gotten some other book. And I was really happy with the cover. I would actually own the cover as an art print in my home because it's
Beautiful,
that
isn't
well
it?
done. Yeah, it's very well done. And then looking within, the context of the book and the way it's written is a huge departure, I think, for pagan books in general, which I loved. I love this, and I'm seeing this kind of as a um, new wave within pagan writing. What are your thoughts on this? Is because you actually had a lot of talks as well when you were writing the book and publishing it. How do you feel about this kind of change that's coming upon pagan publishing right now?
As an insider now to the industry, and as somebody who has spent a lot of time with my own podcast, connecting with other authors and hearing the kind of the back chat sort of stuff that goes on, I think that it makes a lot of sense. I think that the pandemic really affected people's relationship with books. I think that people are now really ready for deeper things. I don't think we're necessarily understanding how deeply and profoundly the pandemic affected people in society. I think suddenly having death very, very, very close to us in a way that I would say we haven't seen since 9/11 in North America has been a big thing. And I think that people are ready for deeper and more experiential pieces. I think that there's also, I think that the demographic has changed too. If we look at, say, the younger witches now, a lot of them are on TikTok and on Instagram, and they're learning and they're connecting in with in a very different format from kind of the book approach. So I think that the book community is aging, and that they're now finding themselves in different parts of their lives and are really seeking something deeper now, because we're in our 30s, 40s, and 50s, right? So I think that is an actual change. I think that also a lot more people are now connecting in with tradition and connecting in with again, reading again, experiencing. I know a lot of people who, like, even on Witch Talk, I'm really connected with dark academia circles, for example. I'm in school right now too, and a lot of the younger folk who are really refinding the classics again, which is really cool. Like, very interested in reading, slowing down, in finding connection again. And I think that's partly due to us being, because of the pandemic, being so disconnected. So I can't really speak. I can't really speak for all of Llewellyn, because I certainly there's certainly a lot of books being put out by all the publishers, but I do notice that shift as well. And I think that there's very good reasons for it. I think I think that is also perhaps where we're looking now. Like I'm certainly recognizing this in myself. I don't know anything about the chakra community or the crystal community or the holistic health community, right? My focus lately has been on the folkloric witchcraft community and the African traditional religions community and those forms of practice. And so I'm seeing a shift within those circles. So I'm cautious to say that it's make a general statement, but I do definitely see the difference coming. And I think that it's again, there's a lot of pieces to it. I think there's a lot of reasons for it. Yeah.
What was it like for you holding the book in your hands when you got the first copy of it?
It was a very strange thing. At that point I'd been working on this project for 2 years.
Yeah.
This project for me, by the time it came out, was 2.5 years from putting pencil to paper. There was a time where it was 8 months where I didn't hear from Llewellyn at all, so I wasn't sure what was happening with it,
Yeah.
and so when I finally got the first of all, I got the e-galley, this was about 6 months ago. I got the digital version, and
Yeah.
that was neat. I loved the front cover. And then they sent me a printed galley, which is not quite correct, and I knew that that was something that I had to go through. But it was the first physical copy, and I think I must have walked around with that for about 3 or 4 days, just in my pocket. I took it to school with me. I was like showing all the people I knew, right? And that was exciting. And then a weird sort of thing happens, and other authors have probably told you this too, but you go through such weird emotions. There was a disconnect from it. I was just getting tired of it. And then,
Yeah.
of course, as I was getting tired of it, and I just wanted to be out and it to be done, I had to start doing the podcast circuit. So I heavily went into the podcast circuit, doing interviews, and so people were asking me questions about stuff that I had already been working on for 2 years. So it's like, yeah, you could tell when somebody goes into a script, right? So it was weird. I was like trying to find an excitement in it. And then I got my box of books, and that was kind of exciting. But I already received about a week before the 2 copies of the finished copy, so that was really exciting. So like it was like the Lord of the Ring. It was like the final Lord of the Rings movie, where it was like this beautiful scene. We go off into the sunset. It starts to dim, and you think this is it, the credits, and then boom, we're into another 10-minute scene. It's like
Yeah. It's a good analogy. I like
so.
that.
Yeah. It was weird, such bizarre feelings, and but now I'm back to that excited mode, and I have to stop myself from constantly going and checking on Amazon to see reviews, because that's not healthy to begin with.
Well, that can be maddening, I think, because I've seen some good and bad reviews, and people can be really
Totally.
awful on Amazon. I don't know why. It seems
People
needless.
people project. This is what
Yeah.
I've learned, and this is what I hear from all my author friends, is the sheer amount of projection that people put onto these things. I I mean, I get it from like a therapy point of view. I get it because somebody is spending time with your work.
Yeah.
And especially those that are written like in first person, or you're spending 8 hours sometimes with this book. It's a very intimate experience, but you're not actually interacting with the author. You're interacting with the author's words. So it's
Yeah.
easy then to feel like you have a connection or a disconnection to that individual, and then take it out. And when it can become very damaging, it can become very dangerous. But I think for authors, we learn very quickly, and I'm in this process right now. We learn very quickly to establish really firm boundaries with people,
Yeah.
and to learn to put that outward face. Yeah. So
I want to ask you about the podcast. You've been doing a podcast for a while now, and you've had 30 episodes. Talk to me about how you thought to make the podcast, and what's been your experience doing it?
absolutely. Doing the podcast is one of the best things I've ever done. And I know you were saying about this podcast of yours as well in similar terms. I originally started the podcast in 2021 when I was writing my book. I was very interested in not only meeting some of the authors who I I was really interested in meeting and connecting with. But I also knew, because I was trying to gain clients at the time, I needed to put content out there in order to gain a sense of, so people would actually see me, right?
Yeah.
So originally, the first season is really most of my friends, people, some psychotherapists I know, and other individuals I kind of came across, and that was it. It was only 14 episodes, and I thought, okay, that's good. A couple of the authors who I interviewed through that, though, ended up being people who endorsed my book, people who introduced me to other people. So skip ahead to this summer, and I thought, I'm going to redo my podcast again. Why not? I had the technology, I had the means. I was like, okay, let's do this. So I started connecting in with some of the other authors I had been connecting with, and said, hey, would you like to come onto my show? And I determined I wanted to have a queer focused spirituality summer. So I didn't really put it out there like that, but if you look
Yeah.
at the guest list, the vast majority of the guests are all queer. And they're all folkloric practitioners, or they're all, they're all authors, right? There's a continuity between them all.
Yeah.
And as I got into doing that, the more I started to gain traction with it, the more fun I had with it too. It can be really lonely when you've spent 2 years devoted to a project. It can become really lonely because other people in your life don't know what it's like to write a book like that and to be published. People don't know. People don't know the bizarre feelings that come up. So to have some of those connections where, like, a lot of them I would end up chatting with for hours afterwards, and we just do, we just like shoot the shit. We would hear the drama. It was a very connecting. And so I really enjoyed that process. People really started to listen in again, and I gained a good following from it. I went from on because it was originally just on YouTube. It's now on Spotify, but I went from maybe 15 to 20 views to suddenly 100 to 150 views per episode. And that is a cool thing to have. But that also speaks to some of the people I've had on. A lot of the people I've had on are much bigger names. I've had like Christopher Hughes, Mara Starr, a huge number of people on there that are really great and grounded. So then I have a podcast coming up for this fall, and I've devoted it entirely to folkloric witchcraft and traditional witchcraft. And I sent the guest list over to my publicist, and working with a publicist at Llewellyn really helped too, because he was able to connect me in with some of the people I really wanted to speak with. He said, wow, this is great. And because it's focused, because it's a mini series, it frees me up to then, create other mini series later on. But I've pretty much done all of the. I think there's only a couple of episodes I need to do. So in the past month and a half, I've done 18, 20 interviews, and all of them have been sharing my stuff outside of that too. I've gotten to know them a little bit better. Other publishers have connected in with me because they see the caliber of the type of questions that I'm asking. So that's been really cool. Overall, it's just been a wonderful experience.
Any guests that I think surprised you the most, or kind of were, I think, maybe had some insights that really blew you away?
I think all of my guests have blown me away, mainly because I only knew them through their work. I didn't know them outside of that. Yeah. I think that one of the, trying to think, I've had some really incredible conversations. I had Madame Permita on a couple of weeks ago, and her episode is coming out in the next couple of weeks. And we were talking about synchronicity. She was writing her Baba Yaga book. Madame Permita is down in Los Angeles, there, quite close to where you are. And her most recent book was Baba Yaga's book of magic. And she was talking about what it was like for her to grow up as a Ukrainian diaspora person in North America, and working with this living culture. And as she was writing it, the Russians invaded Ukraine, and that relationship then suddenly changed with her writing. It became very important for her to put this work out, and that conversation really blew me away. I don't like to ask the typical. So you wrote a book, tell us about it, right?
Yeah.
The questions that everybody gets asked, right? I really
Mhm.
like to get behind, and I really like to get focused on the individual practitioner and the author and get behind. And a lot of the guests have said that they've really appreciated that kind of conversation. So I found that was a very intimate conversation. Um, every single one of them blows me away. Every single one of them blows me away. There's only been a couple where I came out of it and I felt like, yeah, that was a pretty run of the mill conversation. But it wasn't because of them. It was because I was, I was only asking run of the mill conversations, or that there wasn't a need to go deeper. But I since had some of them back on the show and we've gone deeper, so it's okay.
Yeah. So Ben, what's next for you?
Well, I'm currently penning working on a little project that's kind of a sequel to Ancestral Whispers. It's still in that process of promoting Ancestral Whispers, so a lot of my work online is about promoting it. I have a class schedule now put up there. I'm offering classes again after about a year of focusing on the book only. Some of the classes I've got going, I've got it's just an Ancestral Whispers book group going on that'll start in the next couple of weeks, where we go through the various sections. We work on the pieces, so it's like an outlet for people. I've got really focused on moving home. That's really my big focus over the next year. So I'm professionally looking at building a bigger client base, saving money in order to make the big journey home. The podcast is continuing as well. I've got a couple of events that I'm going to be part of. Most recently, I was part of the Salem Witchcraft and Folklore Festival, and I did a presentation there that's still available if people are interested in purchasing that. So yeah, a lot of stuff kind of in the mix. I'm really in a liminal space right now, but really the focus is getting myself home and getting established over there. So
Ben, it's been lovely talking to you. I really want to thank you for taking time out of promoting your book to talk to me. I've really enjoyed getting a chance to talk to you. I hope I get a chance to talk to you again. For listeners, we will have links to the book in the bio, as well as we'll have links to the podcast as well. And you can get that online, purchase that. You're gonna really love the book. I think it's a very important book. And I think Ben's been very modest about this. I think it's going to be something that's going to be talked about a lot in the next couple of years. Ben, thanks for being on the podcast.
thank you so much, Dean. Thank you. And thank you for all the content you've been producing. You've had some really amazing guests on, and I've really enjoyed listening on some of those conversations. So thank you.
Thank you. That means a lot. Have a
That was my conversation with author Ben Stimpson, who has written the new book, Ancestral Whispers, A Guide to Building Ancestral Veneration Practices. We have links to this book, as well as Ben's podcast, Essence Podcast with Ben Stimpson, in the bio. Next week, we'll be speaking with Charles Harrington about the new Tarot of the Vampires, as well as their Murder of Crows Tarot. Until then, I hope that you have a blessed week.